right, everyone. Welcome back to the land of Kem. I am your host and the author. My name is Jeffrey Drum. Thank you all so much for joining me again. All right, everyone. Welcome back. This is episode 25, the timeline for the Egyptian pyramids. Before I kick off with today's episode, I just want to take a moment and say thank you to all of the new subscribers here on the Land of Kem YouTube channel, to anyone that's purchased a copy of my book, to all of my followers on Instagram, and to everyone that comments on these videos. Thank you so much. Words are not sufficient enough for me to describe my gratitude at your overwhelming encouragement and support of my work. It means so much to me, so I will simply say thank you. That being said, today's episode, the timeline for the Egyptian pyramids, we're going to be discussing my theory of the Egyptian pyramids, and this timeline is going to include such events like the cataclysm at the end of the last ice age, the construction of monuments like Gobekli Tepe, the mythological stories from all across the planet which describe the arrival of these technological creator gods. Of course, the timeline for the construction and operation of the Egyptian pyramids, their destruction, and the beginning of the dynastic Egyptian civilization. So just keep in mind, this proposed timeline isn't necessarily relevant to my theory about the function of the Egyptian pyramids. It just gives some structure and framework for the story that I present in the book. I'm anticipating that this is going to be another highly debated topic here on the Land of Kem, and I'm very interested to hear what you think in the comment section below. I think that's it for the intro, so without further ado, let's get right to it. All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we go with tonight's episode. So as I mentioned in the introduction, we have numerous topics on the agenda to discuss tonight, and we're going to start with a brief review of the time period that has been established for the dynastic Egyptian civilization and the dating of the Egyptian pyramids. So let's start with a review of the conventional timeline that has been accepted for the dynastic Egyptian period and the construction of the Egyptian pyramids. So the science, quote unquote, of Egyptology was developed in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, let's say from around 1880 to 1920. So during this 40-year time period, the dogma and the time frame for the dynastic civilization was already established, and it fit very nicely into that preconceived Judeo-Christian timeline of all civilization on the planet starts at around 3500 BC, and there was absolutely nothing whatsoever that came before that. So when radiocarbon dating was developed in 1946, they came back to these structures and started using current technology to actually date these monuments. And it would have certainly been to their benefit to selectively date these structures and these monuments to the time period that they had already established. And with the Egyptian pyramids and with the sites all across Egypt, it is very, very easy to selectively date these sites to the time period of interest that you are looking for. You can see here, this is the Step Pyramid of Saqqara, and this is an area right here on the exterior of the northern side where there is this very, very crude mortar plastered around the outside of the structure. So if you were going back and doing your radiocarbon dating, you could certainly take a sample from this exterior mortar, which was applied much, much later, or from any of these areas that were actually built by the dynastic Egyptians to get your date of circa 3000 BC, and then apply that to the construction of the pyramid itself. So let's take a look at this diagram, which details the construction of the Step Pyramid. So let's say hypothetically that you go here to the outside of the pyramid, and you take a sample of that rough mortar that was applied to the outside of the structure by the dynastic Egyptians, and you get a date that is approximately 3000 BC. Okay, well that's great. It already fits the timeline that you have pre-established. However, we all know from our previous discussions about the construction of this pyramid that the internal components predated anything that happened on the outside of the structure. So the original components of the Step Pyramid are this central rectangular chamber, your inlet shaft, and your outlet shaft. And you can see here in the center that this single level platform was the original construction of the pyramid itself. So they're not dating this from the interior structure. They are dating it from some very crude mortar that came along much, much later that was applied in a renovation effort by the dynastic Egyptians to the superficial exterior of the structure. And in Egypt, it is very, very easy to selectively date these monuments and the sites because there are so many different levels and layers of construction. There is the original construction. Then during several periods of the dynastic Egyptian civilization, there was more renovation and more construction. And then the Romans came around and the Greeks, and they built on top of it. So there are many layers in these monuments and structures that make it easy to selectively date these monuments to the time period of interest. And you can see here this picture from Abu Sir. This is a very, very crude wall that was clearly built much later by the dynastic Egyptian civilization. And these are the large granite blocks which compose the original structure itself. So anyone that wants to date this monument can very easily come along, take some scrapings of the crude mortar that was used by the dynastic Egyptians, come up with a date of 3000 BC. Well, what about this part of the structure? I guarantee you that if you were to date any of the pre-existing megalithic components of these monuments, it would push that timeline back several thousand years. So now let's take a journey back to the end of the last ice age, circa 10,000 BC, and this is where the story of the land of Kem actually begins. So here on this diagram, this is a map of the world at the end of the last ice age, and you can see that North America was almost completely covered by this massive ice sheet. And there are several researchers that are investigating North America during the end of the last ice age, specifically gentlemen like Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson. And I really like both of their work, as they are both proposing that there was an ancient advanced civilization that once inhabited North America. And I happen to agree with that. However, I think I am the first person to propose that this civilization in North America is the proverbial Atlantis. And the survivors of the massive cataclysm that destroyed North America at the end of the last ice age, those survivors fled their homeland, crossed across the oceans, and arrived into these new areas across the globe, bringing their knowledge, their technology, their science, and their magic. But we know that the magic of these ancient civilizations was in fact a practical knowledge of chemistry. So whether it be the mythology of Quetzalcoatl, the Anunnaki of the Middle East, or the mythology of Ireland that describes the arrival of the Tuatha De Danann, these mythological gods with science, technology, and magic, all of these stories relate directly to the exodus of the survivors of the cataclysm that destroyed the advanced civilization in North America. So the story goes that a comet struck the ice cap, which was covering the top of North America. That led to massive flooding all across the world. And again, those survivors would have fled from North America, arriving in South America, arriving in Africa, arriving in Japan, where we have the mythology of Nuar and Fuzi, and they also would have crossed the Atlantic, arriving into the eastern coast of Ireland and Europe. And this is exactly what I propose in the beginning of the land of Kem, is that these survivors arrived into Africa and began to migrate inland toward the Nile River. All right, next up on the timeline is the construction of Gobekli Tepe, also circa 10,000 BC. And the reason I want to discuss this monument is because it's relevant to our discussion of the dating of the Egyptian pyramids. So let's say that this civilization that survived the cataclysm at the end of the last ice age, this advanced civilization that inhabited North America, these refugees are now in an exodus across the world, and they are arriving into their new homelands here in the Middle East. So we have the construction of Gobekli Tepe, dated according to conventional archaeology at circa 10,000 BC, so immediately following the cataclysm at the end of the last ice age. So one of the reasons that I agree with the radiocarbon dating of this site, as opposed to that of the Egyptian pyramids, is because Gobekli Tepe is completely unprecedented. There is no accepted conventional historical timeline that accounts for the construction of this monument, nor the civilization that built it. So it is completely unprecedented in our historical record. Therefore, when individuals and researchers go in to date this site and they get a radiocarbon date of 10,000 BC, I believe that to be fairly accurate, because there's nothing else that they're trying to fit that date into a pre-existing timeline. Quite the opposite with the Egyptian pyramids, where the timeline for the dynastic Egyptian civilization had already been established, set into stone, written to the books by the time radiocarbon dating came along. And with the Egyptian pyramids, as I mentioned before, it is very easy to selectively date these monuments because there are multiple layers of construction during many, many different eras. However, that is completely different from what we find here at Gobekli Tepe. This monument is singular. There are no layers of construction. There are no civilizations that came along after the ones that built this one and built on top of it that facilitate that selective dating process. So I do believe that the radiocarbon date of approximately 10,000 BC for Gobekli Tepe is accurate. I also believe that this monument is in commemoration of the end of the last ice age, the cataclysm that destroyed the civilization, their survivors, and the rebirth of their civilization in the new home. So I propose that it's during this same time period at the end of the last ice age, after the massive cataclysm, and the survivors from this ancient advanced civilization are in an exodus into their new home, and they're arriving in these new continents, already bringing their knowledge, their technology, their science, and their magic, i.e. chemistry. And we see this exact same story replicated across the planet. All of these ancient civilizations have myths about the arrival of these sophisticated creator gods that bring knowledge, science, technology, and magic to an otherwise unsophisticated civilization. And this exact same story is included in the mythology of ancient Ireland. We see in the book, the Labor Gabala Aran, which is the ancient Irish book of invasions, describing the arrival of the Tuatha De Danann, which are the mythological gods of Ireland that brought all of their science and magic to the Emerald Isle. And I find a very, very interesting story from the mythology about the Tuatha De Danann, that when they arrived in Ireland, they set their ships on fire because they never intended to return home. Well, this would certainly be applicable to an advanced civilization that is fleeing from a civilization and a continent that has been completely destroyed by a massive cataclysm. They burned their ships because there was nowhere for them to return home to. They had to stay in Ireland to begin rebuilding their civilization. And this is the story that I paint within the narrative of the land of Chem. And even within the mythology of the ancient Irish, these ancient passage chamber structures of Ireland were not built by the Celts, and they were not built by later civilizations. These monuments are associated directly with the Tuatha De Danann. They are reported to have built and operated these structures. As I described in my video about the function of Newgrange, the Dagda, one of the mythological gods of the Tuatha De Danann, was reported to have been dwelling in Newgrange. So this is certainly not a burial site according to the mythology of this civilization. It is actually associated with these mythological gods that have science, technology, and magic, otherwise known as chemistry. All right, now as the story continues to unfold and I establish the timeline for this ancient civilization, let's move forward to the time period that I use in the book, which is circa 7500 BC, when the Egyptian pyramids are in operation. And we're going to take a look at the migration of this civilization that arrived onto the eastern coast of Africa, that eventually migrated across the Sahara, and eventually established itself around the Nile River. And in this diagram, this is some climatology data that has been compiled for the upper eastern Saharan region. And you can see that prior to 8500, the Sahara was a complete desert. So let's say that this civilization that is fleeing the cataclysm from North America arrived onto the eastern coast of Africa, and the civilization moved across the Saharan desert and arrived into the area around the Nile River, establishing their civilization in close proximity to the river, which you can see here indicated by these red dots, which indicate large population density. So around 8500 BC, significantly more rainfall began to fall in the upper eastern Sahara, and the desert began its transformation from an arid region into a lush, fertile habitat that was primed for agricultural development. And you can see here that the population density spread out from being located directly around the Nile River into all of these areas, which were now being arable farmlands. During this time period, you also have the large-scale domestication of cattle, and this is absolutely critical in the function of the step pyramid, which is the first Egyptian pyramid that was constructed during this time period. So again, we're going back to 10,000 BC. Civilization is destroyed in North America. The civilization arrives into Africa, migrates across the Sahara, arriving into the Nile River area. Around 8500 BC, the civilization is spreading out into these massive farmlands, A huge agricultural industrial civilization was beginning to develop, and the civilization implemented their knowledge of science, physics, and chemistry into structures that would increase the probability of the survival of their new civilization in their new homeland. And as I mentioned before, the large-scale domestication of cattle that was being produced during this time period is a direct influence on the construction of the step pyramid, which utilized that cattle manure to create methane gas. So this is the time period of operation for the Egyptian pyramids from approximately 8500 BC to around 5300 BC. And you can see that by 3500 BC, the Sahara had already been desiccated, and this is the time frame for the beginning of the dynastic Egyptian civilization. And at this point, the Egyptian pyramids had already become completely inoperational, and I'm going to discuss the reasons for that here in just a moment. So this is a depiction of the Egyptian pyramids in their pristine condition. Let's say this is circa 7500 BC, the exact time period that I use in the book. So this is the step pyramid of Saqqara. This is the pyramid of Wanis. You have here the Nile River. This is the floodplain that would have been completely inundated during the flooding of the Nile River. Water would have covered this entire region, bringing the water directly up to the river temple. This water was then conducted into the pyramids and utilized to facilitate chemical reactions. And of course, the chemical reactions occurring inside of the step pyramid utilized that cattle manure, which was being produced in the farmlands that were covering the Sahara during this particular time period. And you can see that the Egyptian pyramids were all built along the Nile River, and this was done very, very intentionally. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a picture, or a depiction rather, of the Mississippi River here in the United States, and you can see all of these little black dots are industrial chemical manufacturing facilities that have been built in proximity to the river, and this is done for multiple reasons. The first being the water from the river is utilized within the chemical manufacturing sequence to facilitate the chemical reaction process, the exact same thing that we have with the Egyptian pyramids. This is also done to eliminate wastewater from the facilities, not necessarily the best for environmental contamination, but nonetheless, this is a reason why these things are built in proximity to the river. And you can see that is the exact same thing that we see in the construction of the monuments in Ireland and in Egypt. So this is Noth, this is Newgrange, this is Doth, and this is Rife, all constructed along the River Boyne. You can also see the exact same construction methodology implemented in the building of the Egyptian pyramids. So this is the pyramids of Giza, the pyramids of Saqqara and Dashur, going all the way down here to Upper Egypt. All right, so now let's review the story and the timeline that has been proposed thus far for the construction and operation of the Egyptian pyramids. So, starting around 10,000 BC, we're at the end of the last ice age. There's a massive cataclysm that completely destroys North America, and the advanced, sophisticated civilization has to flee from North America and reestablish its civilization across the globe, leading directly into the construction of monuments like Gobekli Tepe, which were intended to commemorate the survivors of this ancient cataclysm and the reestablishment of their new civilization. This goes directly into the Neolithic period in the Middle East, which involves the construction of these megalithic stone monuments, which were intended to be beneficial to the civilization at large. These were infrastructure projects, which were intended to increase the probability of the survival of the civilization in its new homeland, specifically regarding the Egyptian pyramids. They were going to utilize the raw materials that were at their disposal during this time period. Again, we talked about the Saharan wet period, the massive domestication of cattle across these new farmlands, and they're utilizing that cattle manure raw materials within the step pyramid for the production of methane gas. It is also around this time period that structures like the Red Pyramid are being built, which was intended to produce ammonia. Ammonia, of course, being utilized for fertilizer, the fertilizer being applied to all of these farmlands across the eastern Sahara, which are now not desert, but they are lush, fertile farmlands primed for agricultural development. So it is during this time period, from 8500 BC to around 6000 BC, that the Egyptian pyramids are fully in operation. However, around 6000 BC, There are a series of catastrophes and changes in the environmental conditions that led to the Egyptian pyramids becoming inoperational. So let's take a look at this timeline that I presented before, which contains the climatology data from the Upper Eastern Sahara. So again, before 8500 BC, it was a complete desert. During the time period from 8500 BC to around 5300 BC, there was lots of rainfall and much more arable farmland. However, around 5300 BC, the desiccation of the Sahara begins. So let's propose that the Egyptian pyramids are specifically calibrated industrial chemical manufacturing facilities that were developed during a time period where there was much more rainfall in the region. 6000 BC rolls around and the Sahara begins to turn back into a desert. This simple change in the environmental conditions could have led to these structures becoming inoperational. If they were calibrated for a specific amount of water during this time period, any changes could have led to them becoming inoperational. So also during this time period, there are other natural disasters which could have significantly altered the amount of water in the region and the calibration of the manufacturing process incorporated inside of the pyramids. You have the Black Sea flood around 5600 BC, and then around 3000 BC, corresponding with the date of the beginning of the dynastic Egyptian civilization, you also have another impact in the Indian Ocean, which would have also caused massive flooding around that region. So there are many natural disasters that occur after around 6000 BC, which could have led to the Egyptian pyramids becoming inoperational. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is exactly what we see depicted here, which I found in a very obscure corner of a hotel dining room in Luxor. And this is the depiction of the Red Pyramid being submerged in a flood, and the flood causing significant changes of pressure inside of the structure, which resulted in an eruption from the inside, blowing off the top of the pyramid, allowing all of the steam or gases to escape from inside the chambers. So I just wanted to make a few closing comments regarding my dating of the construction of the Egyptian pyramids and the time frame I use in the book, which is circa 7500 BC. So many individuals believe that the Egyptian pyramids are 100,000 years old, possibly many hundreds of thousands of years old. And they often use the water erosion that's found on the back of the Sphinx enclosure as evidence of this hypothetical date. However, I simply believe that is an error because these individuals are not aware of this time period from 8500 BC to 5300 BC where there was significant rainfall in the Sahara. And this is the time period that I believe the Egyptian pyramids were built and they were in full operation. However, around the time period of 5300 BC, we see all of those massive cataclysms like the Black Sea flood, the desiccation of the Sahara, and all of these natural disasters which could have led to the Egyptian pyramids becoming inoperational. So also keep in mind that I am proposing that the pyramids of Giza were producing sulfuric and hydrochloric acids. All it would take is one small accident to occur where some of those acidic solutions were spilled on the limestone of the Giza Plateau. And that erosion that you see in the back of the Sphinx enclosure could have been easily caused in a span of 45 minutes, as opposed to being naturally caused by rainfall during this almost 3,000 year period. So again, just keep that in mind. The function of the pyramids themselves are critical to understanding the erosion patterns on the plateau itself. So another point I'd like to make is that after all of these cataclysms around 5600 BC, circa 6000 BC, that led to the pyramids becoming inoperational, that is when we see the beginning of the dynastic Egyptian civilization, and all of the population that was scattered out here between the arable farmlands of this wet Saharan period, all of these populations began to reconcentrate back around the Nile River around 3500 BC, and this is the date given to the beginning of the dynastic Egyptian civilization. However, we can clearly see that that civilization's history dates back several thousand years before then. And around that time period, we have a thing called the Narmer Palette, or the Palette of Menes, which depicts the reunification of Upper and Lower Egypt. This implies that Egypt existed before the reunification period. So there was already a civilization that existed before the dynastic period. That civilization dates back several thousand years, and I believe that we could push back the conventional timeline of the dynastic Egyptian period to incorporate the Saharan wet period, and it would give us a much more accurate depiction of the time frame of that civilization. So again, around 3500 BC, the Egyptians are settling back here around the Nile River. They are re-encountering these now abandoned and inoperational pyramids. They are going in and renovating them. They're doing reconstruction. They're building on top of them, adding to these monuments and transforming them into temples for pharaonic burials or whatever they were going to be repurposed for during the dynastic Egyptian pyramid. And that is the reason that we have that radiocarbon dated, which is associated to the dynastic Egyptian period, because we are dating the work that was done during this time period, not the work that was done previously during the several thousand years before then. And just a quick mention about the Black Sea flood of 5600 and the comet impact in the Indian Ocean, which led to the formation of the Burckle crater around 3000 BC. So both of these events would have led to significant flooding throughout the Middle East, and either of these events could be the genesis of the biblical flood story incorporated in the Bible, the flood of Noah, and also the story in the Indian continent incorporated in the Mahabharata, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the story of the flood and the Ark of Utnapishtim. However, I do believe that these events and the stories that related from them, i.e. those global flood stories, actually go back many, many thousands of years to the end of the last ice age and this Younger Dryas cataclysm. However, the timeline for these events and the mythology associated with them has been compressed to fit the pre-established timeline of 3500 BC as the beginning of all civilization, and absolutely nothing came before that. So this is the narrative and timeline that I have proposed in the Land of Chem book, which is set circa 7500 BC while the Egyptian pyramids are still in operation. And this is a story of a young man's initiation into an ancient brotherhood that was responsible for the construction and operation of the Egyptian pyramids. And in this story, I also present a detailed technical explanation for exactly how the Egyptian pyramids operated, which chemicals they were producing, and what those chemicals were used for. And I'm very interested to hear everyone's feedback regarding this proposed timeline, and anyone that's purchased a copy of the book and read the story, let me know what you think in the comment section below. And just a quick reminder that limited first edition print copies of the Land of Chem book are now available at thelandofchem.com. So if you'd like to help support the channel, just go to the website. You can pick up your copy of the book, grab yourself a t-shirt. Either way, all of the orders mean the world to me. So thank you all so much in advance. All right, everyone, I really hope you enjoyed tonight's video. This was episode 25, the timeline of the Egyptian pyramids. If you liked the video, please leave a like. If you haven't already, definitely subscribe to the Land of Chem here on YouTube and click that little notification bell so that you get notice whenever these videos premiere. If you have any questions, comments, feedback, please leave it in the comment section below and I will get back to you as soon as possible. If you're on Instagram, my IG handle is @thelandofchem. I post on IG daily with exclusive photos and videos from all of my research expeditions to Egypt and Ireland. Again, the website is www.thelandofchem.com if you want to help support the channel and pick up a copy of the book. Other than that, my next several episodes, I have some amazing content coming out. Surprise, but I will simply say that I will see you next time.